Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome to the lab Trevor Keenan, who's come all the way over from Harvard University in the Richardson lab. And without further ado, I'll let you get started, Trevor. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for coming, everybody. Hopefully it'll be worth your while. I am a postdoc in the Richardson lab in Harvard University. I've been there about 2 years. I'm working on model data fusion and quantifying uncertainty in the terrestrial carbon cycle. Today I'm going to be talking about this. Hope you enjoy it. So basically, to put this in perspective, it's kind of focused around climate change. I'd just like to give a little bit of the history of what we consider climate change, because we've got a lot of skeptics out there and people who don't take it into the context of history. And it goes way back to this French mathematician who you might have heard of, Fourier, who actually realized that the Earth should be a lot colder than it is back in 1824, and that it was the existence of an atmosphere that made that the surface of the Earth was actually a lot warmer than it should be. Then in 1849, Tyndall discovered that methane could keep heat in the atmosphere. They thought that it was actually retaining heat and not reflecting it. And then in 1990, they discovered that this carbonic acid, as they were calling it, was also keeping the atmosphere quite warm. And they projected if it were to change in the future, temperatures of the Earth would change. Little did they know that we were actually going to try that out. So in 1958, Dave Keeling, he was the first to succeed in measuring the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And he set up his research station in Mauna Loa. And it didn't take him long to realize that this was going up. And it was going up at quite a fast pace. After 10 years, he could already see a trend. And he had no idea, but it was going up a lot more. So this is what is happening. And what that implies is that, yes, temperatures are expected to change following the laws of physics. We don't know how much because of any feedbacks within the Earth system, but we can already observe that temperatures have changed in the recent past. This is a graph of global temperatures, and you can see the trend line from the beginning of our mid-1800s to now. And as you move that trend line further into the more recent past, it gets more steep. So temperatures are changing. They're changing faster as time goes on. It's kind of worrying. They're projected to change even more. So this is recent changes in temperature, globally separated by regions. And in the orange, you see model projections of how we expect these temperatures to change. This is from the IPCC report. You can argue how realistic these projected temperature changes are, but if they fall anywhere within that range, it's something very, very serious and something we need to address. So that's what my work kind of is motivated by. Of course, it's a huge system. It's very complex. You can't study it all. So I tend to focus on the terrestrial carbon cycle, which is the biggest player in the cycling of this carbon dioxide through the Earth system. This is a graph of the terrestrial or the global carbon cycle. If you notice, these two numbers are the biggest ones on it, and they're the amount of carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere by vegetation and put back in. So through photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and respiration processes put carbon dioxide back into it. And the balance between these two very big numbers is quite a small number, but it's the biggest player in the cycling of carbon dioxide through the Earth system. So what that basically boils down to is changes in either of these two numbers, because they're very big, can have a really big impact on the net amount of carbon taken out of the atmosphere by the biosphere. So to illustrate how big this impact is, this is a graph of global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations by latitude and time. Time is the x-axis, so you see from every year in the northern latitudes, you get this dip, and this is from phenology, or from the greening of the biosphere during summer in the northern hemisphere. Most plants or the majority of vegetation is located in the northern atmosphere, in the northern hemisphere. So you see basically as summer comes, the systems green up, a lot of carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere, and then in winter, a lot of it comes back in through respiration. And this process dictates the interannual variability of the growth rate of atmospheric CO2, and ultimately the long-term trend in the growth of atmospheric CO2. So basically here I'm just showing that terrestrial plants have a huge impact on atmospheric carbon. They're cycling it in and out, so it's very important to understand how they're doing that and how those functions might change in the future. How they do that basically comes down to this schematic, which is the focus of much of my work. So here you see photosynthesis takes carbon out of the atmosphere. That carbon is later allocated to different carbon pools, so it's put into growth into stem, or it's respired for maintenance of that wood. It's put into the roots because the plants need roots to acquire nutrients and water. And then it ultimately ends up in the soil, where it again is respired. And all these happen at different rates. They're dependent on different climatic drivers. And the focus of my work is to understand what is this dependence on different scales. So we want to look at the response of carbon cycle to climatic drivers. This is the most basic. We need to understand this if we want to understand how it will change in the future. We want to make models of this so that we can actually predict what's going to be happening in the future with some kind of certainty to enable governments and policymakers to generally manage our existence in the Earth system. And we want to use all the data available to inform that understanding. So we have measurements that we go out and make. We've got models that we build off hypotheses. We need to merge them all together to inform our understanding. So the talk structure basically is going to be what this data is, what data have we got, how much of it is there, what the model approaches we use are, the general philosophy of my work and how you merge models with data, and some specific questions on how we've been applying this philosophy with the models and data to direct questions. So the data. Much of it is based on this network of eddy covariance towers. Now this is an eddy covariance tower here. They're basically instrumentation at the top which are mounted above these towers. The towers are designed to be above the canopy of terrestrial ecosystems, and they're measuring the amount of carbon going into and out of the system. They're measuring this at a very high temporal frequency, along with the amount of water that's going in, different energy balance components, and the meteorology at the site. So there you can link or couple the fluxes of carbon that you're seeing with the driving meteorology, and you can assess how that changes for different ecosystem types. Along with that, we've got different, we call them ancillary measurements, so there are people who've gone out and measured different aspects of the ecosystems. They get that data together with this, make a synthesis, which informs us into how the ecosystem is working and how it's cycling carbon into and out of the atmosphere. So this started back in the eddy covariance towers. Of course, ecological research has been going for decades, but the eddy covariance methodology was started at Harvard about 1992, and it looks a little bit like this. Basically, here you have time from 1992 to not quite the present. These are what are measured. So net ecosystem exchange is the flux of carbon, or how much carbon is going into or out of the ecosystem at any particular time, expressed in micromoles per meter squared per second, but these are hourly fluxes. And here you see in the winter there's not a whole lot going on. In the summer, the forest greens up. It's a deciduous forest, so the leaves come out. It starts being active. A lot of carbon is drawn into the system. And then in the winter, when the leaves come off, a lot of respiration is happening, so that carbon, a lot of it comes back out. So on average, positive numbers here mean that there's carbon being put into the atmosphere by the ecosystem, and negative numbers mean that it's being taken out of the atmosphere by the ecosystem. And we're interested in the balance between the two and how that balance shifts with different climatic drivers. So that started in 1992, and since then it's proliferated all over the world. So we have these sites. This is the Harvard site. Since then, primarily in the US and Europe, sites began to be set up in the mid-90s. And now, from early 2000s, we have sites springing up everywhere. So we've got a tremendous amount of data to deal with on very high temporal frequency on many, many different ecosystem types. And this is sort of the wave of the future. There's a lot of interest in building these networks. So all of those sites were set up by individual researchers, mostly professors at universities, who had an interest in making these measurements. Usually it was a band of different researchers, so one researcher would be interested in the eddy covariance tower, another would be more interested in soil processes. They get together and some kind of loose collaboration would emerge. From that, recently they've set up networks, data acquisition networks, such as NEON, where there's funding from NSF, I believe, the National Science Foundation in America, for 30 years of a coordinated network of data acquisition. So you're not talking anymore about different researchers taking on different aspects. This is all going to be done by basically technicians who are going to be making the measurements and making those measurements available to the public. So it's a huge wealth of information. It's hard to tell from this graph, actually. Sorry about the quality, but here you have an eddy covariance tower now mounted on a crane so it can get more spatial information. Inside the forest, you've got a huge amount of instrumentation measuring every different aspect of the forest that is deemed interesting for the carbon cycle. So this is a ton of data to deal with. We're also coupling that with flyovers, so high resolution kind of LiDAR measurements of the canopy, coupled with satellite remote sensing, and all of this data focused on something like 62 different sites in America. There's a similar network being set up in Europe, in Australia, and this is really what we're going to be looking at in the future is networks like this, which are fully integrated and have a ton of data on different aspects of the ecosystem. And it's going to be a real challenge to figure out how do we deal with this data. So one way we deal with the data is by building models and using those models in collaboration, usually a loose collaboration with the data. There are two different modeling approaches you can think of. So one is hypothesis-driven, which is kind of traditional global dynamic vegetation model or something like that, where you build in something you've observed in an ecosystem. You parameterize an equation of it, you build that into the model. You couple it with another equation that describes another aspect, and all of these are built on your hypotheses. The other is a data-driven model, such as artificial neural networks, which make no assumptions about the structure of what you're observing. It's a data mining approach, so you don't make any kind of hypotheses and you don't build any structural equations into the model. And both of these are complementary. I use them together and they can work out very well. Yeah, I'll describe it later. So this is the data-based approach, where you've got a lot of different drivers. The ones that we're interested in are light, temperature, environmental drivers mostly, and then some characteristics of the ecosystem itself. You give it all the data, you throw it all at it, it makes these nonlinear connections and predicts what you're observing, and then can hopefully predict where you've got gaps in your observations. So this can be really useful because you don't have to make any assumptions. The other approach is the assumption-based approach, where you have structural connections between different aspects of the system. So here you've got climate variables, the soil characteristics, some kind of ecophysiology, interacting with forest structure. Looked at like this, it seems very simple, but of course everybody's measuring something different, everybody's obsessed with a different process, so you can really build in a huge amount of complexity behind this, and you get all these interacting parts that are all parameterized from different measurements, disparate in space and time, and potentially not even related, and you get something quite similar to a big monster with a lot of parameters. And that can be very hard to work with, but it can be very informative because it's built on hypotheses that can be tested theoretically and should be able to predict outside of the space in which it's trained or the measurements that are used to parameterize it, given that it's built on processes. So those are the two modeling approaches that I use. This is kind of the state of the art where we're at with these modeling approaches. As I said, the process-based model is more adequate for predicting outside the space in which it's been trained, so they're more usually used to predict the future. So here we see the state of the art of the biggest or most commonly used models of carbon cycling, terrestrial carbon cycling, and ocean carbon cycling. And you see, it's hard to tell from this graph, but they really don't agree on how much the land is taking out of the atmosphere in the present day. That range is quite large. And when you run them into the future, they give you very, very different predictions of what's going to happen to the amount of carbon that the land is taking out of the atmosphere. This makes it very, very difficult to formulate any structural policy that will help us deal with the problem of climate change, because if your land is going to be putting into the atmosphere this much carbon, or sorry, taking out, that's the end of climate change. We don't need to worry. Yeah, that's it, done. You know, we can all burn as much fossil fuels as we want. That's fantastic. If it's doing this, that's a negative feedback to climate change, so it's going to be even worse than we predict. I mean, that's a huge range, and it's quite a big problem. The ocean is something similar. We really don't have a very good idea of how much the ocean is taking out of the atmosphere. So I'm going to talk a bit about this issue. But first, the philosophy of the approach. There are kind of two big philosophies out there, I guess, or two big approaches that you could take to science. There's the kind of more theoretical approach, where you make simple systems to get more tractable answers to your problems. And you can idealize and avoid some of the complexity that's out there. Or you could, but you can't really predict very much. That's what I would say. Or you could take a policy kind of driven approach, where we put everything in and we do big scale predictions of how things are going to be in the future with a lot of confidence, so that policy can be made on these projections. These are two very different approaches, but they can benefit from each other, and they can actually be quite complementary if you merge the two together. And that's kind of what I try to do. So talk a bit about the work that I have been doing recently. I've been building this model, basically. It's called Forest Biomass Assimilation, Allocation and Respiration, or affectionately known as FUBAR. And it's a parsimonious model of the forest system. So it's designed to not have too many parameters. It's based on hypotheses, of course. So different process interactions between the different compartments of the ecosystem. So you have photosynthesis coupled to conductance, and that tells you how much carbon is going into the forest ecosystem. That's later allocated to different carbon compartments, which respire at different rates, which leads to the net uptake, or how much carbon the forest system is predicted to take out of the atmosphere or put back in. The idea is to make a fairly simple model that can be informed by the data. Of course, if you've got a complex model, you have many, many parameters, and it's very difficult to get a handle on what those parameters are. So this, albeit a fairly simple model, was designed to be very accurate, taking into account the processes that could be shown to be important by the data, not just throwing in everything in the kitchen sink. And what I've been doing is embedding that in a kind of what you could think of a model uncertainty estimate. It's a bit more intelligent than just a simple model sensitivity, whereas you're optimizing the model using all the data available, and then you're kind of quantifying the uncertainty around the model predictions based on the optimum that you can get. You can think of it as evolution in time. So, well, the traditional approach to modeling is you give it the model a set of parameters, and then you make your predictions. Here, you don't. You search for the best set of parameters available through evolving the parameter set. And at each evolution, you test the model against the observations. And as the parameter set evolves, the fit between the model and the observations gets better until you get to the best, or evolve to the best parameter set. And that can be really informative. It looks a bit like this when you're walking around parameter space. So you start off here, you're looking to get here. So it seems fairly simple. You just wander around in parameter space, always going towards the better fit, and eventually you get down here and you get to the optimum. And that's all well and good when you're dealing with few parameters and few observations, but often it can be a bit more tricky. And most often when you're dealing with a model such as we're using, or observations or systems such as we're treating, it looks a lot like this, which you can't really see, unfortunately, but there's a very complex terrain. There are a lot of places where you can think you found the minimum, but it's not actually the global minimum. So you have to use more advanced techniques to finding that minimum and exploring around it to quantify the uncertainty in the model. So what it means is that we can explore the model. We can explore the parameters that would give you an equivalent fit to your observations. We can use the data to tell the model what it should be doing and to estimate the parameters of the model from the data. And you can effectively merge the model with data, as opposed to the traditional approach where you go and measure one thing here, you measure one thing there, you get some parameters from these measurements and you put them into the model. this uses the measurements directly in a synchronous fashion altogether to estimate what the model should be and tell you if your model's too complex or not complex enough. You can also incorporate measurement errors. Of course, every measurement you make is subject to some sort of uncertainty. We don't know what the real value is ever. And we can, most importantly, give you confidence bounds on your model projections. So some specific questions. As I mentioned, I'm working at Harvard, where we have this really long-term data set, which is really quite cool because it can give you some interesting temporal information on how systems change over time. So for example, here on the right is this net ecosystem exchange that I mentioned before. It's the amount of carbon being taken out of the atmosphere by the forest or put back in. I can't see if you can really see this very well, but basically this is the zero line. Above that, the system's putting carbon into the atmosphere. Below it, it's taking it out. These are annual numbers for how much on an annual basis the system's taking out of the atmosphere. And you can see that since 1992, you've got this long-term trend of quite radical increase in the amount of carbon that the forest is taking out of the atmosphere. To put it in perspective, if this was happening globally, in all the forests, if they all doubled their uptake over 15 years, then that would also be the end of climate change. We wouldn't have to worry very much because the forest would be taking care of it. So it's very important to try to figure out why this is happening. I mean, what's happening in the forest that's driving this change? So this was the first question that we applied our approach to. We want to look at this long-term trend. We want to do it by fusing the model with all of the data so as we don't have to make any assumptions about what our model parameters should be. And to see, while we're at it, if we can use that structure to give better projections of the future, expected future of the carbon cycling of this system. Under climate change. So I mentioned all the data available that we're going to use. There's a ton of data at Harvard Forest. People have been measuring, I won't say practically everything because I wish it was practically everything because there's stuff that they haven't been measuring, but we've got really a lot of information. So we've got this 20-year record of net ecosystem exchange. We've got soil respiration chambers where people go out and put chambers on the soil all over the place and measure how much carbon is coming out of the soil under different environmental conditions. We've got measurements of leaf area, so people go out and they measure how much leaf there is actually on the forest canopy. So that's important to know how much carbon they can take out of the atmosphere. How much leaves are falling off every year and when they fall off. The carbon in roots and carbon in wood, so how the carbon in biomass is distributed in the forest. And the timing of phenology, so when the leaves come out and when they fall off, and how that's coupled to climate because it changes independence of climate every year. And soil, different soil characteristics and turnover times of soil carbon. So basically the idea is that these all represent different things that are in the model, right? So you can kind of couple the model with all this information to try and get it to predict all these things at the same time. You can do that by training it on some of these things, or all of them together, then testing it on all of them together, but in periods that you haven't trained it to see if the model is actually capturing the functional response of the ecosystem to climate. And that's what we did. And basically what you see here is this net ecosystem exchange here in grams carbon per meter squared per day. So that's the black dots that you see. So you see again in winter there's not a lot happening. In summer you get this huge uptake as the ecosystem activates, and in winter you get more carbon respired because there's no photosynthesis happening. And the blue is the model predictions, and if you look at it like this, it looks pretty good. You see, great, the model's doing a very good job. We can all go home. And it's doing a good job for daily net ecosystem exchange, but it doesn't get the trend at all. I mean, it can't reproduce this trend that we observed. And it doesn't get interannual variability. So I mentioned earlier this flying carpet diagram of how the atmospheric carbon is drawn down and put back up into the atmosphere. It can't predict the magnitude of this variability, which is also kind of worrying. So it doesn't get the trend. It's kind of a problem if we want to make any sort of reasonable predictions of the future, if we can't even predict the temporal trend now. So then you're left worrying, why? Why does it not get this? Is it model error? Have we built in the wrong hypothesis into the model? Are the structural connections within the model system incorrectly parameterized? Is it a lack of sensitivity to changing climate? Climate's changing, so maybe the model is not sensitive enough to this long-term change in climate? Or is it data error? So you're left with all these questions, and it's very tricky to know, to have a good answer for these. But one method you can use is a data mining tool, such as the artificial neural network I mentioned earlier, where you don't have to make any hypothetical assumptions. You can train it to the data, and if it does a better job than the model, then you know that your model is wrong. And that's what we did. So here, earlier I presented 18 years of the Harvard Forest eddy covariance flux data. This is the same 18 years split into 3 different periods. So the first 6 years, the second 6 years, and the third 6 years. If you remember from the earlier graph, I should have it on here, sorry about that, but the trend that in the long-term eddy covariance record was only really apparent in the last 6 years. So you had quite a stable period for the first 12, and then with a slow decline, but then a sudden decline in the last 6 years. So what you see here, each circle is 6 years looped over itself, starting in January and going around for the 6 years for each month. These are daily residuals between the model predictions and the observations. So you see here the 0 line in black. Throughout the year, the residuals show no systematic bias, which means that the annual totals should be fairly correct. If you look here, this is where it was trained in the middle 6 years. The same thing. Of course, it was trained to these years, so you kind of expect it to be doing a good job. It wasn't trained to these years, so the fact that it's doing a good job is reassuring. You know that it's getting something right, at least. But when you move to the last 6 years, the 6 years that show this pronounced increase in uptake, you see that there's this systematic bias in predicting summer fluxes. So this tells us 2 things. It tells us that it's not the data that's the problem. Not necessarily. If the instrumentation, for example, was giving a systematic error that was increasing over time, which is what I kind of thought it would be, then you'd see this through the whole year. But actually, the bias, or this increased uptake, is only happening during summer. So the canopy is doing something, which is something quite remarkable, which is doubling its uptake during the summer for no reason known to the model. So then you say, okay, well, maybe the model's just a poor model. Maybe there's something that's missing that it's not getting. So we trained the neural network to the same climate data, and it does a very good job. Actually, the model, the foobar model and the neural network do an equivalently good job, which is very reassuring for the model. And then when you test it in the first period, it does an excellent job as well. And in the last period, it also shows this systematic bias in summer uptake. So you can use this, combine these 2 approaches to validate each other in a way, and say that, well, what we're observing is actually real. We don't know why or what it is. That's why I said earlier I wished it measured everything, because we don't have all the measurements necessary to be able to answer that question. So I mentioned earlier that we were also going to see if the data that merging the data with the model would be useful for informing model projections of the future. So something that models are designed to do. We do that by quantifying the uncertainty in the parameters. So when you optimize the model, you also quantify how uncertain the parameters are. Here you see the 40-odd parameters that are included in the model. The red dots are the optimum parameter values, but the black area around them is where those parameters could be to give you an equivalent fit to the data. So some of them, they're quite large. Some parameters are not well informed by the data. And they don't give a big, they don't lead to a big difference in the model projection. So they might also be that the model is not particularly sensitive to these parameters. And some of them are very, very tight, very well informed by the data, and obviously very important to the model. So the idea is to take these parameters, so the parameters could be anywhere in here, and use all those parameters to project the future, to kind of quantify. This is a quantification of the uncertainty in your model now, and if you use that uncertainty to project the future, you can quantify the uncertainty in the model projections. And I'm not sure about your respective fields, but this is something that is very, very rarely done in our field, unfortunately. And that's why we have all these dispersed projections of the future with no quantification of uncertainty around those projections. And this is what it looks like. So here you've got 100 years of modeled net ecosystem exchange, or the amount of carbon taken out or put back into the atmosphere by the forest, expressed on an annual basis. So, this is photosynthesis. So these are the components of this number. Photosynthesis is how much carbon is being taken out by photosynthesis, of course. And then autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration are how much is respired back by the either living components of the system or the actual respiration of stored carbon in the soil. And the different shades represent different ways of informing the model with the data. So you'll notice that the dark shade here, uncertainty really gets a lot bigger as you get further into the future. By about 2050, you don't know if this forest is going to be taking out carbon or putting carbon back in. And this is what happens if you only use the eddy covariance data to train the model. So if you just use that to tell you what your model parameters should be, you can get really good fits to the present day data by the model. But once you move into the future, you can get these very divergent model projections, which are highly sensitive to the initial parameters. But if you use all the data, so if you use data from different sources, you can get very tightly constrained projections of the future, which are not sensitive to changes in the climate. So you can be very confident about your projections in the future, or at least about the parameter-based uncertainty in those projections. You can also tell where that uncertainty is coming from. So obviously here from autotrophic respiration, including more data reduced the uncertainty in the model projections. Same with heterotrophic respiration. And this led to a large reduction in the uncertainty in the model. Unfortunately, the model doesn't get the trend in the current day right. So we can't really be confident about future projections. So this is a gross overestimation of confidence in future projections because, yes, sorry.
So just to clarify, the different shades of gray, is that different amounts of different sources of data that you're using?
Yes, yeah.
So which is the light gray is using just the eddy covariance data?
No, sorry, the light gray is using all data available, yeah. The black is just using the eddy covariance data, which is, in my field, traditionally thought to be the most data-rich data, or information-rich data, because it's very high frequency, high temporal frequency. You've got hourly measurements for 20 years.
And the middle?
The middle gray is using a combination of eddy covariance data and some of the other data. I'll talk about that in a minute. So this inspired us to try to think about, well, what data is useful? I mean, we've got measurements of everything. Are they all equally useful? Are some of them even necessary? Do we need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars measuring this one thing? Or is there information in some of the other data that is included in this, that tells us about this measurement already, like automatically? So what we did is we set up this experiment, which I was calling Rate My Data, where we train the model iteratively against each data stream. And on each iteration, you'd select the data stream that gives you the best improvement in model performance. So at the end of this, what you're going to see in a minute, I want to explain it before I throw it up there, but the last iteration is using all data together, and the first iteration is just using the best data stream, or the data stream that gives you the most information. Kind of looks like this. Can't see if you can see that properly, but here you've got the first, at each stage it selects the best data stream, or the stream that gives you the best reduction in model projection uncertainty. That are these that are highlighted here. On the right here you see the posterior distribution of model error, we call it. So it's how certain you can be about the model projections. So you hear when you're using all data, your uncertainty is around 1, which means that the model agrees with data uncertainty. But as you add more data to the system as you're moving down, the data provides a huge amount of information initially, but after a while, adding more data doesn't give you a better model. It doesn't tell you anything more about the system. So for example, the timing of leaf out, so bud burst, when the leaves come out and starts the growing season in the forest, it doesn't actually really tell you anything if you go out and make these measurements, because these measurements, that information is already embedded in the fluxes. So in the fluxes is when the leaves come out, you start seeing a lot of activity. So if you're training the model to the fluxes, you can already automatically know when the leaves are coming out. And there are a lot of things like that, such as, let's see, soil turnover is one of the highest ranked. And in the presence of soil turnover, having soil carbon estimates of the stock of soil carbon and soil respiration is not very informative, because you already know what the turnover time of the soil is, so you can infer the stocks and the respiration. These next two graphs, I don't know if you've worked with Magic Eye at all or played around with it. It really helps if you have. But if you blur your vision a little bit, you start to see some patterns. This is what happens to parameter uncertainty as we add more data to the system. You'll see that here the parameters are all highly uncertain. Just using one data stream doesn't really inform you of what the parameters should be. The parameters could be anything and give you an equivalent fit to that data stream. As you add more data to the system, parameter uncertainty reduces, but about here, parameter uncertainty doesn't really get any smaller. So adding all this data, going out and measuring all this stuff is not necessary for our question of carbon cycling. The same for making projections of the future. This is net ecosystem exchange, projected 100 years into the future. Here we see from the previous graph this explosion in uncertainty in the future as you get past about 2050, and how much that is reduced by the addition of each additional data stream. And you see that relatively few data streams really constrain the future projections of carbon cycling. So if you're interested in projecting carbon cycling, really you don't need to measure everything under the sun. You just need to measure these 6 or 7 key measurements that are information rich and really tell you a lot about how the system is working with regards to carbon cycling. So the conclusion, I think I just went through them, but yeah, our projections of the future are obviously an underestimate of the real uncertainty because we can't get this short-term change, and we still don't understand why. There's a lot of work being put into that now because it's a very big question. Why is the forest changing its uptake so much, and why can we not predict it when we have theoretically all the data we need? So long-term trends are very sensitive to initial conditions. If you use all the data to inform the model, you get very good projections. If you don't, if you just use the data, which is net ecosystem exchange, which is the most traditionally used in my field, you get this high sensitivity to initial conditions, which could in some way explain those divergent projections of terrestrial carbon uptake that I showed earlier. We can use model uncertainty analysis, I'm calling it, or model data fusion, basically integrating models with data to really help reduce this uncertainty. And this, I really believe, is fundamental to advancing our field. And we don't need all data. Not all data is equal. Some data is more useful than others. So I'm going to talk quickly about interannual variability because I mentioned it earlier, and I highlighted as something else that the models don't really get. So what we did to have a look at this was we took 11 sites with the longest measurements records in the world. So that gives 91 site years. This is really good because you can really get a handle on what that interannual variability is with these long-term sites. We used 13 models and 3 remote sensing products to evaluate whether the models were doing a good job or not. And we were looking at variability. Lo and behold, the models did a terrible job. This is the chi-squared evaluation of the models against the data. Basically, it's on a log scale, so you can't even see 1. But anything above 1 is far outside measurement error. Basically, what I want to say here is that the models didn't get this interannual variability, but we couldn't really tell why, because you've got a bunch of models that are all parameterized differently. They're not parameterized using the data directly. So you've got this huge introduction of error from parameterization, which made it very difficult. All these models have very diverse characteristics, and we couldn't tell what characteristic was particularly better or worse, which is really frustrating. We did, by looking at it in a context of variability, we realized that canopy phenology and snowpack dynamics were systematically among all models poorly simulated, but those weren't necessarily the reasons for all this bad model performance. So to address this, we decided to decompose the time series. So you can look at time series in modes of variability at different scales. So up here you have the original net ecosystem exchange time series measurements from the eddy covariance on a daily basis. You can decompose that into variability at different modes of variability. So you've got down here the interannual variability that I mentioned earlier. You can also get seasonal variability, monthly, weekly, daily, and you can do this for models and data alike. So to contrast how variability for models, how models are capturing variability at different modes of variability, and if that explains the poor performance for annual variability. So we did this for the optimized model. We also did it for the artificial neural networks, and we tested. I'm going to present the results against the monthly anomalies as a kind of a case study. This is what it looks like. Basically, this is the correlation of the monthly variability in the model with the monthly observed variability. This is the correlation of the residual between models and observations with different climate drivers. So here you've got humidity, air air temperature, and radiation. So what you can see briefly from this is that models tend to do particularly well at different sites. And the models that don't do well at these sites have strong covariance structures with different climatic drivers. This tells us that you can improve these models by building in these, or improving the representation of the impact of humidity, here in this case, in the models. But more interestingly is the neural networks as data mining tools, they kind of can be perceived to be the best you can do. So they're kind of, you can consider them a quantification of the actual coupling of the observations to the meteorological drivers. And actually some sites aren't coupled at all to the meteorology. Just interesting. And some of the sites are very coupled. And the models that tended to do well did better at the sites that showed the strongest coupling to the meteorology, which was reassuring. Especially the FUBAR model, which was trained at each of these sites. LOTEC was also trained at each of these sites, and the other models were not. So it can show you that LOTEC and FUBAR are relatively simple models. All of these other models are some of them are really, really complex models. So they have a lot of process representation. And this shows that with a very simple model, you can actually capture the majority of the dynamics of the system. I should mention that some of these sites that are not coupled to the atmosphere, it's not because of measurement error, it's just because the ecosystem below them is very heterogeneous. So depending on where the wind is coming from, you get fluxes coming from a different system. So for example, this Park Falls is a tower that's really huge, 100 meters high. So the footprint of that tower, we call it, or what it's seeing, is very diverse. But I just wanted to use that as an illustration of how you can go into a lot of detail with these fluxes. You can apply a lot of different techniques such as neural networks or variance decomposition. And they can tell you a lot about how the models do and how, what's necessary to model these systems. So we're applying the same approaches to a lot of different kind of questions. I spoke about this focus because that's what has been my main work for the last 2 years. Obviously, I've been doing a lot of other stuff. I'm very interested in assessing the impact of phenology on model errors. How accurately do we need to model phenology? How errors in phenology feed forward into errors in the carbon balance when the modeled carbon balance. Different allocation model structures. Obviously, you have different residence times of carbon. When it enters an ecosystem, it can stay there for a long time and then be released, or it can be cycled through quickly. And this is very important for the reactivity of that carbon pool to changes in future climate. A really big question that I'm interested in is how complicated do models need to be? Can we build simple models that are just as good and by removing parameter error? Volatile organic compounds are emitted by most plants, and they react with atmospheric chemistry to produce impacts on ozone concentrations, and they're also very interesting to model. And patterns in biogeography. I guess I shouldn't put all that up there because it's just confusing, but it's stuff that I'm really excited about. So future directions, basically, I think this says it all. We've got these research stations that are continuously monitoring and have been doing so for more than a decade, a lot of them. It's a huge amount of information. It's a lot of data, and we really haven't figured out what's the best way to deal with it. It's all up on the web, actually a Microsoft-supported website where you can download the data. But then developing techniques to really interpret the data and merge it with models is very challenging, especially for people from academic institutions who are not always computer savvy or have the resources at hand or the technical advice next door. And that's being merged in systematic ways with different remote sensing techniques and different instrumentation. Yeah, and the future problem for our research is going to be to figure out how to use this data, how to merge it all together in models to give a better informed projections of the Earth system, with the end goal being that policymakers can and will actually do something with this information because we can give them a more confident information on what the future is expected to be like. That's what the future is expected to be like right now. We really need to do something about that. I mean, that's very low information content if you want to make any decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
That seems somewhat relevant. Questions?
about the future. And so you're advocating somehow finding the optimal parameterization of your model. In some sense, what you really want, you don't really care about your model parameters somehow. What you really care about is your predictions. So given that, why is optimizing the model parameters the right approach rather than doing something taking into account, for example, a range of model parameters to generate predictions?
Right. So optimizing the model is important to be able to quantify the uncertainty in the model. So the optimum, I'm not really interested in the optimum parameter set exactly, but the space around that set, how close or far away from that set you can be and still give an equivalent model performance. And I'd say that the objective is not necessarily to give constrained projections of the future to be able to better inform, because as I showed, there are lots of things that we can't predict, like the current trends. But an optimized model which has a quantification, a constrained quantification of uncertainty, is easier to falsify. It's a lot easier to highlight where it's going wrong because you're very confident about what it's doing.
Can you say a bit about how you incorporate the statistical errors in the model optimization?
So, well, every data source has its own error structure. For example, the eddy covariance measurements, so it's a pretty well understood double exponential distribution of error around proportional to the size of the flux. We can incorporate that into the optimization using the cost function, which is the quantification of the difference between the model and the observations. So basically everything is made relevant to the observation error. So if your model predictions fall within the observation error for a particular observation, then it's considered to be doing a good job, basically, in non-mathematical speak. And we do that differently for all the observations. So each different observation has its own independent quantification of the error associated with it. Yep.
I was really interested to see your experiment where you're adding the data stepwise, because doing stepwise building of models but holding the data, you see the other way around is quite common. So you just sort of say, well, here's my data set, and then I add different effects into the model, and you do model selection, and you kind of keep the effect that gives you the greatest improvement against that fixed data set.
Right.
The next one. But what you're doing is the other. You've got a fixed model.
Yeah.
And then you're actually adding the data sets in order. So I thought that was really interesting to see. And that's something that I'd like to see more of in ecology. But I was wondering, you seem to know quite a lot about neon and flux nets and things. I mean, do you think the community would be quite receptive to that? Because you could use that to advise them about where they should be putting their research dollars in terms of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Quite receptive to that.
Yeah, I was talking with Dave Schimmel, who's the guy leading NEON, and explaining the work. He hasn't seen the results yet, but he thought it was very exciting, at least. So yeah, I think they'd be very receptive. I mean, if you can, there's so much more we were really constrained for that experiment with computing time, because basically it takes a lot of computational reiteration of running the model with different data combinations. And so if you could combine that with a more factorial approach, and also the cost of acquisition of the data, it would be really informative to tell you, okay, this is not worth that much, but it doesn't cost that much. So does it tell us something proportionately useful? But yeah, I don't have the resources to do that right now.
I'm interested to know the thinking behind the Fugger model in itself, why you decided to choose a new model, build a new model. Where did it come from?
Well, so when I started the project, the idea was to use an existing model. But I looked at all the models, and they're all subject to the PhD syndrome, I call it, where people doing their PhD, they get very focused on a particular aspect, and they develop it to, for years. And so you get this, as you term it, unbalanced model, where you get a huge amount of complexity in one part, and then everything else is simple. So I decided it's a balanced model where each component has a similar level of complexity, which I found incredibly difficult to find out there in other models. Yeah. So I decided to just build one.
Are you aware of similar initiatives there to do the balancing with, like the community climate model and aspects of the community climate model? What is happening in the general community of building components
I don't know. I don't. I think it's very hard to take something out of a model once you put it in. And it's been very difficult to quantify what to take out. So I presented the model study where we had 15 different models. Some of them had like 15 soil layers. Some of them had one. Some of them had multiple canopy layers or just one big leaf. And we couldn't tell which was better. They were all
How do you physically
poor.
compare 15 different models? What can you see? What can you control?
Just the output.
Oh.
Yeah. Done in that framework, just the output. So each modeling team submitted their model runs. Some of them were obviously hadn't been. One model, I won't name it, but it killed all the trees at one forest, a temperate forest, from water stress in 3 years. And that's what was submitted. So these are all parameter problems that people just set a parameter wrong, and then the model output doesn't make any sense for obvious reasons. But it's very hard. So that's an extreme case, but all of them are subject to this parameter uncertainty, where people have picked a parameter, and so you change that parameter, you get different model output. So it's very difficult to tease apart model differences apart from parameter differences.
You seem to be one of the few that's worked on incorporating observational uncertainty. So
Right.
from what you've seen, how important is that, I think, in terms of the performance of the model that you get here?
Well, it gives the model a lot more wiggle room. So it becomes a bit more difficult to constrain your model. But of course, if you've no uncertainty, you're assuming your measurements are right. So you get an over-constrained model to that particular measurement.
But did you ever try the test where you just say, let's assume the data is...
Oh yeah,
certain?
yeah. You get more certain predictions from your model.
Right.
Of course. If you assume the data is right, then the model is more confident that it's
Are they
right.
sort of systematically different from the predictions you would have got?
I haven't done it for predictions of the future. Yeah, you would just get a model that is overconfident. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see if it's overconfident in the wrong direction.
You're right.
If not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't done the experiment, but.
Any more questions?
Yeah, just a quick one about, you mentioned neural networks as the approach you were using. I just wondered how you came up with that and what alternatives you considered for the data-driven modeling.
Right. So there's not a whole lot of it being done in my field. There's people using regression tree analysis for upscaling. So a lot of it's focused on upscaling these point observations from different towers in space. Neural networks seem to be the most intuitive way of doing it. I'm not an expert by any means on data mining, so it was more directly understandable that I could do. But I'm sure there are with neural networks, there's a lot of things you could do that would be much cooler. So they're just obviously the instantaneous response of the system to a driver, whereas real systems will have lags at different timescales, which neural networks, at the most simple neural network can't get. I know there are more complex ones that are focused on that. But yeah.
I have a good question.
Sure.
So I'm wondering about the sort of software aspects of these models, and in particular, you had your slide where you had about 16 or 17 different models played off against the same data with sort of color-coded results. Could you set up a website that would allow people to submit the models? Imagine a model is fairly small bit of software or a bit of code or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
In small compared to the size of the data you're testing against.
Right.
So that, could you have some sort of API that would allow one to write a model and then just play it off against the others?
Yeah, yeah. I think you could, and that would be fantastic. Having all these models merged in a similar framework would solve a lot of these problems. But the main problem is the input and output formats for the models. So how the model understands data and how it reproduces or outputs data or its results. Having that all in a streamlined, that would involve a lot of code editing and things like that, which becomes a very much more involved project.
So you need a standard format?
Yeah, you probably would. Yeah, because they're all driven with standard drivers. But how they expect to get those drivers is different between different models.
What do they consist of, these models? Is it chunks of R or something?
Mostly C code, Fortran.
C code?
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, that would be fantastic to have them all in a common kind of system. But I think it might be a lot of work.
But yeah, state-of-the-art DGVM is probably thousands of lines of code.
Yeah, yeah.
And our system model is millions of lines of code. So pick up about static intercomparisons. It's more than just to compare people. It's more than the work. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like comparing the design of a Rolls Royce with a CO2 or something like that. They're hardly different. There's a hell of a lot of differences.
Yeah, there are a lot of differences, but the system is the same. Yeah. So you could
That's it, yeah.
you could put them together, I think. Yeah. I hope. Because we're gonna have to.
Someone should do it.
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much, Trevor. Fantastic.
Thank you.